Well, I did not grow up as an animal rights activist, although I would have been one had there been a movement. I grew up in Pennsylvania. I was surrounded by hunting and attitudes towards animals that were pretty conventional, and from the very earliest age, I had a very, very strong affinity for animals, and even as a very young child, I hated to see animals being mistreated or abused at all. I saw dogs being punished in order to become hunting dogs. I saw dogs chained up in lonely houses at our own home. I saw bats being killed with newspapers for fun, and all of those things were very disturbing to me as a child. But I was not aware of large-scale animal abuse, and this was in the 50s, 1950s in Pennsylvania. As I began to get older and to learn what hunting was about, I would have arguments with my father at the dinner table about hunting. I would confront him about the cruelty of it, even though we were eating animals on our plates, which I didn't even think about as animals back then. But already I was becoming aware of hunting as a cruel activity, and I was becoming confrontational about it. So I already had those stirrings that would later become the animal advocacy that I practice today. I grew up eating a lot of meat and not giving a thought to it. But certain things happened to me as I got older. I can still remember, for example, going to the Lexington Market in Baltimore, Maryland, after my classes in social work. I would buy a whole barbecue chicken, and I would sit in the boarding house on the floor where I was staying at the time in Baltimore, and I would devour this entire barbecued chicken. And every once in a while, I would encounter a vein or something, and I would think, oh, what is that? It kind of made me aware I was eating somebody who had once been alive. But even at that time, I was not really thinking morally. I was only thinking about, ooh, what is this disgusting thing? So I did not grow up as a precocious child. I wish I had. I've met people who said that from a very young age they were morally opposed to and just felt a disdain for hurting animals. And I did too, but it didn't translate into my awareness of what was on or who was on my plate. But then I read in the early 1970s an essay by Leo Tolstoy called The First Step. And in The First Step, Leo Tolstoy is describing what he considers to be a true Christian. That is, a Christian who lives the life that he believes Jesus Christ intended for people to live. A life of absolute simplicity, totally non-materialistic, and completely nonviolent. And in this essay, he urged nonviolence against animals as the first step toward nonviolence toward all. And that was a sufficiently compelling argument for me. But what really, really got my attention in Tolstoy's essay, The First Step, was his description of his visit to a Moscow slaughterhouse. And the description was so powerfully conveyed, and it was so sad, and it was so horrific that for the first time in my life, I was imbued with a full awareness of what eating meat meant, and that meat meant animals, and putting animals through horrific practices and situations. And from that moment on, I stopped eating all meat. It was just Tolstoy's essay. I also read an essay by somebody who represented philosophical yoga. And they were describing some of the deleterious effects of eating animals on one's body, as well as in one's spirit. And those two treatises I read around the same time, and together they had a terrific effect upon my consciousness. I did not have to be talked out of believing that I needed to eat meat. I did not have to ever be talked out of a belief that, well, we have to use animals for research. I never believed that we had to use animals for those purposes. I simply did what I had been brought up to do and to think without thinking and doing what everybody else did. But always with that early sensibility toward animals that began to really come into focus as a consciousness and ultimately a philosophical perspective that led me to decide that I was not going to eat animals anymore, and that made me more aware too of the suffering of animals on a large scale. In March of 1974, I took part in a tour to the seals in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the harp seals who were just being born on the ice floes. And I was under the impression that we were going to an ice floe, an area in the Magdalen Islands, where the seals were protected. And the whole idea was to persuade the islanders that tourism would be more financially valuable than just beating these seals to death with clubs. And so I went on the tour, and to my horror, the landsmen were just slaughtering seals just for sport up there. And I was so devastated and traumatized by that experience that I went back to Montreal. I couldn't even go back home to Baltimore right away. I just had to go and hole up in a hotel and just process the situation. And for 10 years, I stayed away from animal issues. I felt that I didn't have the stamina, the mental stamina, to endure learning about those types of cruelties, feeling I couldn't do anything about it, and just having those images in my mind. So I shied away like from a hot stove. But in the early 1980s, several things conspired to bring me into what was then forming as the animal rights movement in the United States, and led me to become an animal advocate myself, an activist, that is. So the things that happened were, for one thing, I was teaching a class at the University of Maryland to nursing students, and one of my students wrote a paper in which she exonerated a researcher in Silver Spring, Maryland, who had done horrible, cruel experiments on monkeys. And that was right at the time that PETA was forming. And PETA formed around that issue of the Silver Spring monkeys at the Behavioral Research Institute in Silver Spring, Maryland. And I read the student's paper, and she pretty much just glossed over what the monkeys had been subjected to, being burned with cigarettes and all kinds of terrible things. And she exonerated Dr. Edward Taub, the lead researcher. And I told her that if she wanted to get a higher grade, or at least try for a higher grade than an F, which is what I gave her paper, she would have to do more research and present a more comprehensive look at the whole situation and why Edward Taub was found guilty of animal cruelty in the state of Maryland. And this unleashed in the classroom an entire uprising of deep and apparently unshared feelings amongst the nursing students, the pre-nursing students, who were being required as part of their coursework to do animal experiments of various kinds, pithing frogs and other things. And it turned out that virtually every nursing student hated what they were being forced to do, was of the opinion that there was no point in what they were being made to do for a grade. And they were being told that, in addition, as nurses, they were expected to be professional. They were expected to never get involved with their patients emotionally. And as one student put it succinctly in a paper she wrote, "I want to be merciful, but I have to be professional too." And what she was basically saying was, I feel there's a conflict here. If I am professional, I cannot be merciful. And if I'm merciful, I cannot be a nurse. And isn't that bizarre? But this was a deadly serious experience for the students. And it all grew out of my telling that one particular student that her paper was insufficient and that she would have to look deeper into the reasons that Edward Taub was convicted of animal cruelty in the state of Maryland. So that semester was very instrumental in bringing me into the animal rights fold, which I was barely even aware of at the time. I barely knew who Edward Taub was then. But then another event was the Washington Post article about Ingrid Newkirk. And PETA had just been founded then by Ingrid Newkirk and Alex Pacheco, who were the chief whistleblowers on the Edward Taub Laboratory in Silver Spring, Maryland. And the article in the Washington Post about Ingrid Newkirk, it was a very long article, and it was very dismissive of Ingrid. Ingrid had been the chief animal control officer in Montgomery County, Maryland, outside Washington, D.C. for at least a decade. So she wasn't coming from a purely theoretical point of view. She was coming from in the trenches kind of work, seeing the kinds of everyday cruelties to which animals are subjected, dogs, cats, and other animals are subjected in everyday life in households and you name it. So she was well grounded in the issues before she started PETA with Alex Pacheco. So this article was very demeaning towards Ingrid, and kind of in the title there was something about how there was this funny little lady in yellow plastic shoes. And one of the episodes the article described, the writer was named Chip Beck, he described Ingrid cupping her hands with water for chickens who were sitting in broiling summer heat on a loading dock at a Frank Perdue slaughter plant in Salisbury, Maryland. And when I read that, I was very moved by what Ingrid did, and I was also affected by how the writer treated that as a kind of a joke. So I saved the article, and I called information and asked if there was a group that had a name like PETA, and were they in the phone book, and I was told, no, there's no such thing in the phone book. This was before we had everything digital. So then the next issue of the three big things that happened was that I saw a little item in the Washington City paper about World Laboratory Animals Day in Lafayette Park in Washington, D.C. And I said to my husband at the time, you know, I would really like to go to this, but I'm afraid to go to it because I'm afraid of the kinds of images I'm going to see there, and I'm going to be very upset by all that, and I don't know if I can handle it. However, I was drawn inexorably to Lafayette Park, and that was the day that I made my pledge to myself and to animals that never again would I abandon animals to the iniquity of our species because I could not bear the suffering that we were inflicting upon them. I felt at that moment, as I looked at those images, those huge posters out on the grass, on the tables in Lafayette Park, that I knew that I had to try to do something in my own life to help these animals. And the two images that completely penetrated my awareness in particular were one, a beagle who had been used in a burn experiment, who had been thrown back into the laboratory cage and was on some type of wire grid floor. And the other was of a non-human primate who had been used in a head transplant experiment, who had big black sutures all around his or her neck. And what really struck me was the look on their faces. The wounds and all of that were hideous and horrible enough, but the look on their faces, each said, to me, they said something like, why have you done this to me? The look of misery, of agony, of everything terrible that a living being could be subjected to was in the eyes and in the faces of this beagle and this non-human primate. And those two images especially led me to make that pledge to myself and to animals that I would never again, ever say, I can't bear what they're going through, and so I'm not going to help them. So from that moment, I was, and have been ever since, an animal rights activist, working to change the fate of animals in the public domain. At the time, I had no idea that I would ultimately found an organization that would focus on chickens and turkeys and other domesticated fowl. But in the 1980s, I began reading extensively into the animal rights literature. Not only contemporary literature, not only Peter Singer's Animal Liberation and philosopher Tom Reagan's The Case for Animal Rights, but I started reading through the history of treatises and books about animals and the suffering of animals that existed, but that very few people even knew about. The poet Shelley wrote very movingly about the suffering of animals and protesting eating animals in his poems and in his essays. And I discovered there was this whole sort of underground, untapped literature about our treatment of animals throughout our history. So I was also learning at the time about factory farming, which I knew nothing about until I read Peter Singer's Animal Liberation. And it was the chapters down on the factory farm and the animals in laboratories called Tools of Research that had the same effect upon me that Tolstoy's description of his visit to the Moscow slaughterhouses had on him. In other words, the conceptual arguments for the animal consideration of animals and their rights was sufficiently compelling to me, but what the real argument was the detailed description of what the animals themselves were enduring in being, in this case, locked up in industrial farms. And I was really just completely agonized by everything I was reading, but I was also learning that of all animals exploited on the planet, basically 95% are farmed animals. And at the time, it was being argued by Henry Spira and some other activists that although 95% of the animals we abuse are farmed animals, only 5% of the resources of the animal advocacy community is devoted to farmed animal issues. And at that time, virtually all of the animal groups, the large, older animal groups, all of their board members all ate animals, which was a big reason why they didn't want to deal with the farmed animal issue. And to this day, we see in the environmental movement, as we just have seen in a film called Cowspiracy, basically ignores probably the #1 cause of global warming, certainly a major contributor to global warming and environmental depletion, which is animal agriculture at all levels, as even the UN has pointed out, from global to local. So the 80s were my formative period. That was when I was seeing all the videos of the circus animals and behind the scenes, that is, the behind the scenes of the circus, behind the scenes of the rodeos and the rodeos themselves. And I was going to all of the demonstrations and that were being held in the Washington area. And the Washington, D.C. area was filled with the ferment and the fervor on behalf of animals and animal rights. It's like, we will not be moved. And there were speeches, and there were all of these energies being devoted to animals and animal rights. And so as I got involved in all these different issues with the various groups that sprang up in the Washington area, I was being more and more drawn into the farmed animal issue. And at that time, I believe it was 1985, 2 people living in Wilmington, Delaware, started going to the Lancaster, Pennsylvania stockyards. And one of the things they discovered in going to these stockyards was that all of the animals on the dead piles were not really dead, that many of them were alive and dying and wounded. And so they started taking these animals to their home in Wilmington, Delaware, their row house. Well, this turned out to be Farm Sanctuary, and I went to work as an intern at Farm Sanctuary one summer, and that's where I really got to know chickens. That summer, it turned out that also our landlady in the little house that my husband and I were renting on a 1-acre piece of property in Montgomery County, Maryland, was raising about 100 chickens each summer for agricultural tax write-offs. And I began visiting these chickens, and almost by the second day, they would be at their little door of the shack they were being kept in, awaiting my arrival. And so in the afternoon, I would go and I would sit with them, and they would all surround me, and they clearly enjoyed my company, and I discovered how much I cherished being there with them and being accepted by them. Well, one day I went down to visit the chickens in the early afternoon, and the little shack was empty. And our landlady tried to say, oh, well, we sent them to a farmer for eggs. But by that time, I was reading pretty extensively into the farmed animal literature. And I knew, because they were very large chickens and several of them were crippled, that they were the chickens who were being raised for the meat industry. Well, about 2 or 3 days later, I walked down the little path where the shack was located, feeling very sad and very bad. And I peered into it, and I saw movement in there. And I went around to the little door, which was tied, the latch was tied by a string, and I pulled the string and I went inside and I looked inside, and there was a very crippled hen. And she was very covered in dirt, and she looked very small and weak. And I gathered her up and I looked in her face, and she didn't even make eye contact, which is a sure sign in a chicken that they have suffered, because chickens have excellent eyesight and they always make eye contact. So, but I didn't know all that exactly at that time. So, but I brought her into our kitchen and I set her gently down on a towel in the kitchen. And my husband looked at her and he said, well, we should name her Viva, because she's the one who lived. And she was my first real experience with an individual chicken, and I was so moved by how sweet she was and how she would chirp up when I would enter the kitchen, and I made up a nice little place, a bed for her. And one of the most touching things was how if I would set her outside in the grass, she wanted to move, but her legs didn't work. So she would go through a very painstaking procedure to balance herself on her wingtips so that she could run a little ways. She would then collapse into a heap. She would be exhausted, and she would rest for a while, and then she would go through the whole procedure again, delicately and carefully balancing herself on her wingtips so that she could run again. And she also had this little purr that she would give off, a little trill, like a purr, and it was just so touching. And I would stroke at the bottoms of her feet, which she really liked. As I say, she was very crippled, but they were so soft, and everything about her was soft and vulnerable. And I also began to notice one day that she was starting to have wounds under her wings and on the inside of her thighs. I had no idea what was wrong with her, and I took her down to a veterinarian in College Park, Maryland, who explained to me that because of her physical condition, she was harming herself and that she should be euthanized. And it was one of the hardest days to have to part with her, to have to realize now I would make different decisions, but at that time I turned her over to the veterinarian, and I waited in the waiting room for the veterinarian to bring her back out because I wanted to bury her back at home. And the veterinarian eventually came back out with Viva in a box, and she said, well, she wouldn't die quickly enough, so we had to give her a certain type of injection. And to this day, I don't just let a chicken ever be taken away. I sit with them if they have to be euthanized, and they're euthanized in my lap with a sedative. They become unconscious, and only then can they be given a lethal injection. But as I say, I learned as I went, and I brought Viva home with me. I thought about the fact that the container I had taken her alive in, I was carrying her back dead in. And it was a very hard thing, and we buried her in the yard. But I have a lifelong affinity for birds. I have always felt very deeply about birds. I couldn't stand to see a bird fall out of a nest when I was growing up in Pennsylvania. I would cry and almost get feverish if a bird was hurt. And I didn't know chickens, but there was something about meeting Viva and getting to know her and learning about the vast number of chickens, because of those 95% of farmed animals being exploited on the planet, over 95%, I learned in the 1980s, are chickens. And so my affinity for birds, getting to know Viva, working as an intern at Farm Sanctuary in the mid-1980s and meeting those chickens, and knowing about these vast numbers, I just realized that I needed to start an organization that would focus on chickens, and at Farm Sanctuary I also met turkeys who I didn't really know before, and bring my love of birds and my knowledge of what animals were going through in farming industries to create an organization that would focus on educating people about the plight and the delight of chickens and turkeys. And at the time, some people in the movement, in the animal rights movement, cautioned me against starting an organization on behalf of chickens. They said, well, we can't even get people to care about whales. How do you imagine we're ever going to get anybody to care about a chicken? And my response was, well, if we as animal advocates take that attitude, we're creating the situation ourselves. We're certainly making it be true, when in fact, as advocates, we need to develop the skills and the care to be able to elicit from people the feelings that I believe people do have for chickens and other farmed animals if we learn how to speak to people and become the knowledgeable and passionate activists that we should be. So I was not dissuaded by those who cautioned me against starting an organization for chickens and turkeys. I was more determined than ever that this was my calling and that this is what I wanted to do. And in 1990, in October of 1990, I officially founded United Poultry Concerns as a nonprofit organization dedicated to the compassionate and respectful treatment of chickens, turkeys, ducks, and other domesticated fowl. And this is our 25th anniversary this year, 2015.